Hello and welcome to lecture number 3 of the series To Be or Not to Be, wherein we're going to be covering specific portions for paper 4 for the upcoming Mains 2022 exam. The syllabus that we're looking at to officially cover in this particular lecture are essentially 4 points from your syllabus: ethics in public and private relationships, ethical concerns and dilemmas in government and private institutions, ethical issues in international relations and funding, and corporate governance. Now, the official text of the syllabus, which you can see here, translates into a larger basket of questions. Now, what is important to note here is some of these are asked in a theoretical form, and some of these are asked in the form of case studies. And we can easily pattern them through our past year questions and figure out which parts are asked from a case study format and which parts are asked from a theoretical perspective. So when we look at personal or private ethics, professional ethics, public, government, corporate ethics, environment ethics, gender ethics, technology, media, international, military, bioethics, and so on and so forth. When we look at dimensions of it, we look at it from an individual point of view for civil services, society, businesses, nations, and the world at large. Now, it is practically impossible and also incredibly difficult for you to prepare all of these in the right amount of depth. And because this particular portion is asked in the exam in a very restrained manner, in a very controlled fashion, you can prepare this topic rather selectively, and a lot of common points from this topic are also available to be applied elsewhere, even if the text or the subtext or the context of the question changes. Let's quickly look at the previous year questions and understand what do we derive out of them. And we will do this in a reverse chronological manner. In 2015, there was a direct, simple, straightforward question, which was, what is meant by environmental ethics? Why is it important to study? And discuss any one environmental issue from the viewpoint of environmental ethics. Now, this was a standard theoretical question asked in the context of international global environmental developments that were happening, from global conferences to UN Conference of Parties to so on and so forth. In 2015, you will see a larger emphasis on questions which are theoretical in nature, emanating from geopolitics or international relations. Look at the question. At the international level, the bilateral relations between two nations are governed on the policy of promoting one's own national interest, without any regard for the interest of the other nations. This leads to conflicts and tensions between the nations. How can ethical considerations help to resolve such tensions? Discuss with specific examples. So this complicated question actually explains to you a very simple problem, which is a critical analysis of bilateralism and national interest, and how national interest could be a problematic issue for the interest of the other nations. And there are several examples that you can pick up from. In 2017, there was a larger sort of a national economic kind of a question. Without commonly shared and widely entrenched moral values and obligations, neither the law, nor a democratic government, nor even the market economy will function properly. What do you understand by this? Explain with illustration in the contemporary times. So all you've got to do is divide it into 3 specific parts: moral values and obligations for law, moral values and obligations for government, moral values and obligations for the market economy. What is the current state? Where is the problem? What should the moral values be? What should the obligations be? Where have they gone wrong specifically in circumstances? And in a simple point form, you will have enough of an answer for a 10 marker. Now, when we look at some of the more recent questions, you will see a slight change in the way they've been asked. In 2017 itself, you will see sort of one question directly from IR or geopolitics, and the second question which is more sort of argumentative in nature. Increased national wealth did not result in equitable distribution of its resources. It has created only some enclaves of modernity and prosperity for a minority at the cost of the majority. Now, the question nowhere specifies India, but of course the context is India, but it is always advisable to give international examples in questions like this. Now, the question here might seem a little complex, but all that it is saying is that it is a fundamental debate of capitalism versus socialism, and that's all that there is. In 2017, you will see a principles of geopolitics question. Strength, peace and security are considered to be the pillars of international relations. Elucidate, which means what is the right way to demonstrate strength, how is strength being demonstrated, where are the ethical problems, where are the specific instances where there have been ethical conflicts, and how do we resolve them, and applies to the rest. Now in 2020, the will to power exists, but it can only be tamed by rationality and principles of moral duty. Examine this in the context of international relations. This is again a larger enunciation of national interest, regional superiority and global dominance. Now, what are the challenges what are the ethical issues when a nation wants to be a superpower or a nation wants to singularly advance its own interests? Discuss the role of ethics and values in enhancing the three major components of comprehensive national power. Now, while this question seems like an IR question, and it is to a larger extent, it also looks at what your internal policies are and how do we make them better by eliminating the ethical challenges. Your components of national power are, or comprehensive national power are, human capital, soft power and social harmony. Now, because it's a 10 marker, you can't get into a lot of extraordinary detail. What you could possibly look at is the primary challenge with human capital is labor welfare. The primary problem with soft power is cultural hegemony. The primary problem with social harmony is social discord or some sort of a division in society. Now, how do we sort of balance that? How do we eliminate that? How do we get over that? That's what the question is about. Then in 2021, a very specific issue of conflict in IR was very specifically asked. This was the first time. Refugees should not be turned back to the country where they would face prosecution or human rights violation. Examine the statement with reference to ethical dimensions being violated by the nation claiming to be a democratic one with an open society. Now, this question was asked in an international context and a national context as well. Internationally, several countries in Europe were not accepting refugees from troubled nations, and nationally we of course took a very hardened stand by not allowing the Rohingyas to come to India, who were of course facing persecution in their home country. So a question like this, which always sort of prompts you or pushes you to explore and to figure out the other side. You will not find a question like this in other parts of the GS, in other parts, because this is fundamentally controversial. They will never ask you, do you think India was right by saying that Rohingyas should not be allowed to India, or do you think India was right in the way the CA amendments had taken shape? Of course, not a lot has happened, but the law itself, because you can take up the core issue and then discuss it ethically, which is what happened in 2021. So therefore, what do we understand with the kind of questions that have been asked over the years from this specific topic? We understand that when we look at the course syllabus, there has not been a single question which has been asked from ethics in public or private relationships, which therefore makes it a priority. And you haven't been asked a question on corporate governance from a theoretical point of view. There have been questions in the form of case studies. There have been questions from public and private relationships in the form of case studies. But specific theoretical questions have not existed. Second, when we see those national armchair questions that capitalism versus socialism or creation of wealth versus inherent inequality, you will see larger indirect questions highlighting dilemmas of public institutions. You will not see these questions in the form of case studies because these are larger policy sort of driven questions, which is why they are more suited to a theoretical question. And thirdly, there has been an ever growing emphasis on international ethics. In 2021, there was a specific issue based question that was asked, and apart from that, there have also been principle based questions. Now, because they've been asking this for a long time, either two things are going to happen. They will continue with the trend and ask a question in 2022 from IR, or they will take a break and say that we've been asking IR for quite some time now. We'd like to not ask an IR question in ethics anymore. If they do ask a 2022 question in IR, there are essentially going to be two kinds of questions that are going to be asked. A larger principle based question, which we will prepare, and within the principle based question, there would be a larger question in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war. I don't think the Russia-Ukraine war question will be the focus of it all, largely because India had a very limited role to play. Of course, it had ramifications, and of course, we have diversified our oil inputs and all of those things, but it has not been a major stakeholder in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We've had impacts, we've changed some of our foreign dealings because of it, but not particularly from an ethical standpoint. So, nonetheless, once we prepare a larger principle-based IR question, we can always merge the conflict into the question and still answer it effectively. So, this is our analysis. What is also very interesting to note is, and it's a part of our syllabus, it says international relations and issues relating to funding. Now, there has not been a single theoretical question from here, nor a question from the case studies point of view, largely because from a case study point of view, it becomes too open-ended. From a theoretical point of view, it becomes too technical because the sources of international funding are fairly diverse. Towards the end of the lecture, I will still give you an outline of this. Just in case there is a question, you will have enough to write, because this is nothing but an amalgamation of whatever you would have studied already in international economic development and of course non-state actors. So we're going to come to that eventually. So this is what we understand. So what are we going to study? We're going to study public and private relationships. We're going to study corporate ethics. We're going to study media ethics. And we're also going to be studying artificial intelligence ethics. It is my view that it is long pending, and if there is a question, it must come. And of course, we'll close the class on international ethics in this lecture. So let's begin. Our first topic for discussion today is ethics in private and personal relationships. Now, let us first understand the kind of questions that may be asked. Either we may get a short note differentiating between the two, or we may get a question on does one impact the other and how do we sort of balance both of these relationships. So let's begin. We're going to do a simple tabular comparison. I've given you some examples within it itself so that it's easy for you to remember. So public relationships versus private relationships. What is the fundamental meaning? Public relationships arise out of professional or of a non-personal space. Any relationship that you have by the virtue of what you do or what position you hold is what is called a public relationship. For example, a relationship between an employer and an employee, relationships between colleagues, interactions between colleagues, public service. Because you are the head of a district, you are a public office. Now, you may not directly be dealing with a specific citizen in that district, but your relationship with that a specific citizen in your district, by the very nature of the position that you hold, is in fact a public relationship. That is also the case with business owners and customers. Now the question is, this also sort of overlaps with business ethics to a standpoint, but that's largely how it works. Now, public relationships, because you are dealing with relationships that are an outcome of your employment or your service or your occupation or your business or your profession for that matter, the impact of it may be known and unknown at the same time. For instance, there will be an X number of students who I teach directly. There will be a Y number of students who would learn from YouTube, who would learn through videos being circulated here and there. Now, my teachings will have an impact on how they prepare for the exam. I will only know the impact of it in terms of my limited interaction with a few students who send their answers to me for correction. While if somebody else has interpreted something and has gone on to a different tangent, then it is beyond my control. The point I'm trying to make here is, public relationships will often have either a known impact or an unknown impact, and that is the most difficult part of it. You don't know the decisions, the actions that you've taken, and what impact are they going to have for people that you may not directly know. On the other hand, private relationships function slightly differently. They primarily arise out of a personal or a social space. Either you're related to somebody, or you're attached to somebody, or you're a part of a community or a social group, or some form of a family space. So any relationship that arises out of that is usually called a private relationship. Now, some examples of those would be parental, sibling, spousal, relatives, or friends, right? So for example, your relationship with your parents would be dependent on you and your parents, and the impact of it is also going to be on you and your parents. So that's the second point of difference within the meaning space, that it usually has an impact on known subjects per se. Now the question is, if there are relationships, there must be something governing them, there must be something dictating them, there must be something that would be sort of putting a boundary on them. So when we look at public relationships, they're usually either codified, but they do have some form of a formal shape. This could be in the form of laws, regulations, rules. For example, if it is about a business-customer relationship, or if it's about an employer-employee relationship and the employer is, let us say, owning a company, then certain elements of the Companies Act, certain provisions of our labor codes, which have been recently implemented by the government, for example, the Social Security Code, the Industrial Safety Code, and so on and so forth, they will apply to private business relationships. They will apply to relationships governing good practices at corporations, at any junction where there is an employee and an employer. Whereas on the other hand, when we look at civil services, we will see that how you are, what you do, how you portray yourself, all of this will be, for example, if you're in the All India services, the All India Civil Services Conduct Rules will apply. If you're in the central services, the Central Civil Services Conduct Rules will apply. If you're in the state services, then you have state-specific laws. And also, a lot of companies have HR policies. They are not codified in the form of a national law. There's nothing called the National Tata Human Resources Act. But the Tata group of industries will have some consistent HR policies that they are going to implement for the well-being, productivity, efficiency and welfare of its employees. But the moot point amongst all of this is that a public relationship is fundamentally governed in a structured manner. There is something that will tell you X is okay, Y is not, A is okay, B is not. Whereas private relationships are relatively more informal in nature. They're informal in nature in what context? In the context that your attachment towards your parents, your behavior towards your parents, your sort of association with your parents will depend on the kind of emotions that you have for your parents. If you've had a supportive upbringing, if you've had a great home, if you've had a supportive childhood, if you've not had a troubled childhood, if you will always have an extraordinary relationship with your parents. But if you've had an abusive childhood, if you've seen mishaps at home, you may not have a very healthy relationship with your parents, with your siblings. That's the difference between a functional or a dysfunctional family. Several families are dysfunctional because of certain events that would have happened, which have sort of soured the relationships within the family as well. And a lot of times these relationships are governed by local customs. These customs could be governed by religion, could be governed by community, could be governed by caste and so on and so forth. For example, a lot of religions also have festivals which have a very strong component of fasts. So when fasts are broken, they're celebrated, it is a matter of prestige and so on and so forth. For example, in a lot of religions, it is customary when the child is born after a few days or some time to have the child's hair to be shaved off. Now that is also a community gathering. So over these periods will you interact with a lot of your relatives, your families and so on and so forth. For example, there are also customs which say that, you know, when you are sort of buying a new house, there should be some religious activity which is called the Griha Pravesh, and it also becomes sort of a local family event. So your relationship with your parents or your siblings or your spouses, your partners, your relatives, your friends will be dependent on a lot of this. There will be no set of guidelines that will say that you have to be nice to your brother or sister, or if they identify with another gender. There is no such guideline like that. But you will still adhere to it because there is an informal nature to it. Now, of course, the composition of these associations have changed. We have joint families, nuclear groupings. So, for example, the kind of association you would have with your relatives if you're in a joint family would always be stronger than if you are in a nuclear family where you only get to meet them for occasions. But if you're in a joint family, you will meet them more often than not. You will meet them almost on a daily basis. But how, because of urbanization, because of nowadays children living away from their parents or from their relatives, the only time you really get to meet your parents or your relatives are on festivals or on some relative getting married, or there is a death in the family, or any sort of a major event. So all of these things have also changed, right? Now, similarly, you will not have a similar association with all your friends. You will see that the friends that you would have had from school versus the friends that you would have had from college versus the friends that you would have made during your, say, civil services prep versus the friends that you would make once you're at the academy, once you're working. They're all going to be very different formats. The kind of a bond that you would share with your school friends versus the kind of bond that you would share with your batchmates would functionally be different. And there's a reason why. Because when your batchmate becomes your friend, then this line becomes slightly blurred, because you know your batchmate because of a professional position. But now you have a personal association with your batchmate. So what are the considerations for your relationship with that person? So that's the difference. Now, How do you control them? Who is responsible? Who dictates what is right and wrong? When we look at public relationships, we understand that the locus of control, the epicenter of control in public relationships, is largely external, which means in the form of laws, regulations, code of conduct, code of ethics, best practices, favored practices. There will always be an external variable telling you this is okay, this is not okay. But when you look at private relationships, it's always internal. Even if you have great relationships with your parents or you have terrible relationships with your parents, the only two people who know to govern and execute that relationship are going to be you and your parents, and that's it. It is how the both of you interact with each other in the space that you interact with each other will decide the nature and the discourse of your relationship. Now, what happens where there's something that goes wrong? What happens if an employee feels that they have not been rewarded for their work, or if an employer feels that the employee is not working hard enough? There will always be some form of a formal or a technical prescription in place. It would usually be a professional or a legal consequence. For example, let us say if the owner of a firm is embezzling money, then there is of course provisions in the law through which the owner will face criminal action. In the same way, if let us say an employee is forging receipts for travel and faking them so that you could get more money, then you could either have a penalty on the employee or you could also see the person being dismissed. There are several such cases. So the point here is a breach of conduct in public relationships always leads to some professional or legal consequences which have been identified in a formal manner. Whereas when we look at the breach of private relationships, because you will not always see very clearly indicative actions. For example, let us say there is a child who disobeys and disrespects and disregards their parents. Now, the parent might disown the child and maybe exclude the child from the inheritance. But this is an individual decision. There is no law that says that if a child misbehaves with a parent, the child will not be entitled to inheritance. It's an individual decision which has been taken, which fundamentally emanates from the worsening of ties. Relationships turn sour. As a result of this, you will always see a lack of communication, you will see a lack of support system, you will often very popularly see sibling rivalries, which in this country have seen the division of some of the most well-known corporate houses in the country. You will often see ego clashes, you will often see a sort of a betrayal of some kind, that in the sense that the younger sibling went behind the back of the elder sibling, or the elder sibling went behind the back of the younger sibling, and so on and so forth. So these are some of your examples. So in the exam, if you get a question, differentiate between public relationships and private relationships, this is enough for you to write an appropriate answer as far as your 10 marks is concerned. Now comes the larger discussion, which is, are they related to each other? Is there an impact between the two? When we look at an impact evaluation of all of this, this is what we understand, and this is sort of very important. The first and the primary question is, are they correlated? Yes, they are. You are a great boss, but a terrible husband. There is a correlation. You are a great husband, but a terrible boss. There is a correlation. So let's understand what the correlation is, and let's understand how do they impact each other from a larger scheme of things. There are several psychologists, there are several philosophers, there are several thinkers who would say that public and private relationships operate in a separate space, But there are also a higher number of thinkers and philosophers who will say you will always have an impact, because at the end of the day, it is an individual action which violates an ethical code of conduct, whether it is formally notified or informally. So yes, and what you must add as students appearing for the civil services exam is even more so in public life. If the managing director of an accounting consulting firm has conflicting personal and public values or ethical conundrums versus, let us say, a collector or a secretary or a commissioner of police or a commissioner of income tax, there are going to be different implications, because by the nature of your job, your public life and your personal life, there is a very blurred criteria. Whether it's also true for politicians, it's also true for judges, it's also true, or it's true for anybody which is leading a public life of any kind, whether it is an actor, whether it is somebody in the film line, or a writer, or a YouTuber, anybody for that matter. So there are two specific questions that come in. One is, private ethical quotients impact public spheres, which means how you are privately will impact what decisions you take publicly. How you are as a person privately will have an impact on what kind of decisions that you take in a professional or in a public capacity. This is understood by something called the normalization paradox. When something happens at home which is incorrect, but it happens in an unchecked manner, it is normalized. For example, when women who are sort of homemakers, right? We'll take the first example. When women who are sort of homemakers are not given the same kind of respect and the same kind of dignity as opposed to the men who are traditionally in patriarchal households primary breadwinners in the family, it then normalizes a few things. That first, women are secondary in their positioning, and two, this is their primary job, and three, they must be discouraged from doing anything else. So for example, in houses, right, in houses where women occupy a secondary status, right, are often the houses which will not encourage women to pursue demanding careers. Now, how will that have an impact? For example, let us say you are the HR head of one of India's top pharmaceutical companies, but you come from a very traditional household and you are a male, for example. And in your house, women are supposed to be homemakers, they're supposed to have limited education, and they are supposed to have a domestic natured life. Now, in your office, a man and a woman, both equally competent, with equal years of experience, similar degrees of education, similar competency, everything, are due for promotion to becoming, say, the national sales head of that pharmaceutical company. And it is up to you to recommend the promotion of either of the two. Because you would come from a specific setup, because you would come from a mentality wherein women are supposed to have a subordinate role, it may go into your head and you would say that, listen, this lady who's up for a promotion, if not married, will get married, if gets married, will eventually have a child, and therefore she will not be able to be equally committed to the company as much as the male counterpart would, and therefore you will automatically be biased in favor of the man to get the promotion. And this very small instance contributes to a larger phenomena, which is called gender gap. Now this further accentuates by the fact that there are very few women, for example, at leadership positions, which is also why you will often see not very neutral policies and actions of corporates. And I'm going to come to that when we sort of discuss corporate ethics and AI ethics and so on and so forth. Similarly, children of politically or financially affluent families usually tend to demonstrate a sense of entitlement. This is especially true for the northern belt, where you would often see issues of road rage, issues of youngsters barging into a restaurant if the restaurant is closed, or fighting with, say, the management of a health institute or a gymnasium where memberships are full or the timing has been closed, and so on and so forth. It also sort of then leads to a sense of objectification, eve-teasing of women, and so on and so forth. Now, why does this happen? It happens because when the family is politically or financially affluent, but the upbringing or the general environment in the house is not a humbling one, wherein the children are not taught that all of this comes with a lot of effort, all of this comes with a lot of hard work, and just because you are affluent doesn't mean that you have to be influential, or just because you are affluent doesn't mean that you have to be entitled. Because because the fundamental principle of inequality is that if somebody is higher than the other, there are a lot more people who are not as equal as you. So that should be humbling, and that should be something which must take you back. But if that kind of an environment doesn't exist in the household, then it is always going to be a problem. So how the house is will determine how public relationships are. Similarly, for example, let us say there is a police officer who has a personal view that sex work is morally wrong, it is ethically wrong, it is sort of degenerative to the idea of what women are supposed to be, even if it is consensual, and so on and so forth. And let us say at his police station, a sex worker comes with a crime that she wants to report. The police officer will not treat, let us say, a sexual offense against a sex worker with the same degree of seriousness as a sexual offense against a person who's not a sex worker. Now, this would be subconsciously done, but it would fundamentally originate from what your personal moral compass is. So, does this impact his job professionally? Yes, it does. It really, really does. So, for example, when children of politically and affluent families decide to go work, and let's say they start work at an organization or a company, even if it is that they've been given a job on reference or on recommendation, you still have to work as hard as everybody else for you to get to where you are. Now, the opposite. Do public ethical standards impact a private outcome? Now, this is what is called the judgment paradox. Because of an event that has happened publicly, there is obviously going to be a yes or a no, a judgment that is made, whether this was right or wrong. By nature, all of us, or most of us, do tend to have a sense of judgment about things. There are very few people who are not judgmental. There are very few people who are going to tell you it's okay, it's fine, there might be a good way, there might be a bad way, but you do you, basically. That there are very few people like that. But most of us, by human nature, will tend to have an opinion on the basis of what we see. Now, is that necessarily a good thing or a bad thing is not something which is a purview of your syllabus. But if there is a public perception about somebody who you also share a home with, how does that relationship work? Is there an impact of some kind? And for that, there are three specific examples that answer yes, there is. For example, in Western countries, it is generally understood that children, after they have finished their education, move out of the houses of their parents, live separately, work separately, and the relationship between the parents and the child is a fairly distanced one in most cases. Now, let us say you're an Indian who has moved to the US, and a few years your parents have also moved with you. But most of your friend circle is not of an Indian origin. And when you tell your friend circle that, listen, my parents are also staying with me, and my family stays with me, we are a collective household, you may not get the kind of appreciation that you would in India. Because the general judgment is that if a child in a Western country is staying with their parents, even if the child is taking care of everything, the general perception is that the child is severely attached to the parents, which is the problem. Second, for example, let us say there is a politician, and usually criminal charges against politicians are fairly common, and criminal charges against politicians are, if not convicted, but they definitely exist in the form of an accusation. Now, even if it is in the form of an accusation, we must understand the impact of it. So let us say there is a politician who has been charged with a very heinous offense of murder or grievous hurt. Now, the politician is battling this publicly. It is a matter of regional news, it's a matter of national news, and so on and so forth. The child of the politician studies at a school, and the child of the politician mercilessly beats up his or her classmate. And when the school reprimands the child, and then the father or the mother tries to reprimand the child tells the father and the mother, who are you to tell me not to beat somebody up? From what I heard, you've killed somebody. I have not even killed somebody. So there is always going to be an impact. Thirdly, from a commercial sense of point, from a business sense of point, right? Now see, this is relatively sensitive, but we often hear these terms in India that it's a service family, it's a business family, it's a political family. Now, when we say it's a service family, it's a business family, it's a political family, it's a Fauji family, the general understanding is that there are certain characteristics which are associated with these kind of families. There are certain characteristics that are accentuated with these kind of families, which is sort of where the problem lies. So, for example, when we say a business family, for example, when we look at the traditional arranged marriage ecosystem, that a service family should not necessarily marry a business family. The traditional notion is that the values will not match. Why will the values not match? Because service families are usually inclined on a completely different tangent than what business families are. I'm not saying X is right and Y is wrong, or Y is right and X is wrong. No, that's not the case. But business families, because businesses run on sustainability, businesses run on profits, businesses run on margins. And when you're doing this for the rest of your life, you will look at things from a very, very statistical point of view, from a very transactional point of view. And therefore, that ecosystem will also show a similar mentality in your family. Is that right or is it wrong? It doesn't matter. I'll give you a very simple example. A business family will always say, at the end of the day, money matters. A service family will always say, well, it's not the most important, because a lot of other things are more important. The kind of work you do is more important. The impact that you have is more important. A social status is more important. The business family will say, I'd rather have money than social status. A service family will say, I'd rather have a comfortable standard life. I don't need more than an X amount of money, and over a period, social prestige will be more important than an uncountable sum of money. So these are impacts. Who you are, what you do, will have an impact on how you are at a personal level. And this therefore explains the impact evaluation. And this sort of concludes our public and private relationships. Now, when we look at business ethics or market ethics or corporate ethics, we must understand there are going to be theoretical questions on this, and we try to cover as much as we can in this sort of crash course. If you get a question, how do you introduce the question? How do you write an apt introduction? I've given you 3 points, and the 3 points sort of set the tone to business, corporate or market ethics. The first is corporations legally are also legal persons. This is very important. A Reliance Industries Limited and the Ambanis are legally two different entities. In the eyes of the law, they looked at two different entities. They looked as two different entities. So, the point is, if corporations are legal persons and just like human beings are also subjected to moral scrutiny, if individuals or human beings are subjected to moral scrutiny, then corporations who are also considered as legal persons will also be subjected to moral scrutiny of the corporations. So, for example, when a Union Carbide Corporation or a Xenon or any of these conduct worldwide malpractices, then they would be judged as companies. That this was a malicious company or this was a fraud. For example, investment banks which misadvised during the 2008 financial crisis, and key executives of those investment banks were also sent to prison. Those investment banks were considered what is called malicious or ill-willed, and probably that is from where the term crony capitalism originates in our day-to-day lives. So when we look at it from an ethical perspective, what is it that we understand? From an ethical perspective, we understand that the corporate, the business activities, what they do must go beyond legal compliance. No doubt, if the law asks you to do A, B, C, D, E, great. The law says report your expenses. But the question is, what are you spending on? What is it that you are producing? The law says whatever it is that you are selling, fine, go ahead. Just make sure that your books are very clear on it. But what if you are selling poison in the form of fast food? What if you are selling poison in the form of tobacco? What if nowadays, arguably, you are selling poison in the form of processed foods? So, the larger question therefore is, do you have legitimacy in the eyes of the broader community? And this legitimacy underlines the societal license to operate the business. This is also the fundamental philosophical basis of corporate social responsibility. That in one form or another, in one way or another, you exist because you extract natural resources and you have an obligation to the community at large. And therefore, the law allows you to legally exist, but ethical compliance grants you validation from the community, the society that you live in on a daily basis. So these are good enough points to start your introduction with, and then of course we'll look at the rest. From the introduction, we therefore move to the layers and the levels of ethics in a business environment. Now you see, how does this work? When we look at ethics in a business environment, it starts at the individual level, goes up to the organizational, industrial and systemic. UPSC mostly has asked systemic questions. Because they've asked enough systemic questions, I think there is a good chance for them to go a little lower the scale. So what are systemic ethics? Why are they important? See, systematic or systemic ethics in a business environment largely deal with issues of ideological discussions which are a very crude distinction between socialism and capitalism, between a free market or government intervention. Now, whether they ask you a specific ethical issue such as disinvestment, or let us say increasing FDI, or let us say production linked incentives, or let us say tax breaks, or let us say an incentivized tax structure, or let us say special economic zones, any of those things, all of those largely come from socialism and capitalism. Whether it is about monetization of the asset pipeline, whether it is about strategic sale of certain government assets, whatever it might be. It's fundamentally a question of socialism versus capitalism, right? Now, especially in the recent years, this systemic level has become far more acute, has far more nuanced, with different views on different levels of government intervention. For example, is the government supposed to provide for everything? Is the government supposed to regulate everything? Is the government supposed to facilitate its citizens so that they can achieve anything and the government becomes an enabler? Or is there a balance between all of those? And that's largely the journey of India's socialism. And it would be inaccurate to say that India is fundamentally a socialist country, because we are not. Yes, to a large extent, we have government intervention. On one hand, we do have the Ayushman Bharat mission, which makes us the world's largest national health insurance provider. We also have the MG Narega, which is the world's largest food for works program. The railways is fundamentally owned by the government. A lot of our telecommunication is also owned, infrastructure is owned by the government. A lot of that is there. But also at the same time, we are also one of the world's largest emerging markets. We're also one of the largest markets in mobile manufacturing. We have one of the world's largest number of private airlines. So there is, of course, a balance between the two. So it would be incorrect to say that we generally, I see this as UPSC aspirants, is that they usually write India is a socialist country, India is a socialist country. Well, that is factually incorrect. Because as much as India is a socialist country, we also have enough instances of capitalism. Now, at the industry level, now if I give you a little bit of an example with respect to systemic ethics, for example, when the 2008 global financial crisis that happened originated from the US and had a global impact, what were one of the arguments to solve the global financial crisis? It was that the same people who believed in an open competition and the free market and how the world must fight and compete for resources, it was the same people and everybody else who said we need governments to bail out institutions. We need governments to give money for private institutions so that they exist. Otherwise, the domino effect is going to be far too disastrous. And that's something that we begin with. From an industry point of view, when we look at ethics in a business environment, it largely addresses questions on ethically controversial industries. For example, tobacco, alcohol, gambling, fast food. Now, traditionally, we used to look at tobacco and gambling and alcohol, but today, the instruments and the instances of poison have also diversified, right? The instances of poison have also diversified. So, for example, when we look at it in terms of today, we look at processed foods, we look at fast foods, we look at controversially, we look at, let us say, to a large extent, online dating communities, online marriage bureaus, all of those. There are some issues that fundamentally exist in those. So these are industry-wide problems, especially in terms of, for example, gaming today, in terms of the forms of fast food. For example, nowadays there's a larger ethical question on, do we really need a 15-minute grocery delivery? Do we really need people to deliver food to us within 10 minutes? What difference would it make if it came 3 hours later, or the following day, or this evening? Those are industry-related questions. Then at an organizational level, you have something completely different. At an organizational level, you look at business integrity, ethics, where the role of the directors or the senior management of the corporation, they are usually being scrutinized. For example, when we see senior executives often resigning on ethical conflicts, or senior executives often caught in ethical conflicts. For example, the Satyam scandal. For example, senior executives of the 2008 crisis involving financial institution, banks and investment banks. For example, let us say the Radia scandal, the corporate tape scandal. For example, let us say owners of companies who have fled India, like a Kingfisher or a Nirav Modi or a Vijay Mallya and so on and so forth. Or for example, let us say Lalit Modi, who was declared an economic fugitive officially by the law. They all hold positions of superiority in respective organizations and companies. And then, of course, at an individual level. At an individual level, how does business ethics or business environmental ethics operate? It addresses the behavior of individual employees. As an employee in a business ecosystem, in a corporate ecosystem, how do you behave? For example, someone might work for a corporation with a good reputation, in an industry with a good reputation, but as an individual still engage in unethical behavior. For example, the Tata Group of Industries usually have a very high ethical reputation. But does that necessarily mean everybody who works at Tata's is ethically extremely compliant? That might not be the case. The reverse might also be true, that you might be completely ethical but working for an unethical organization, right? So, sort of applies. So, when we look at business environment, when we look at business ethics, these are the compositions of it, these are the larger ramifications of it. Now, the more important questions as to why does this happen, how do we solve it, what can we do at an organizational level, at a policy level, and so on and so forth. No matter what the question on business ethics is, on market ethics is, whether it's about wealth inequality, whether it is about segmented forms of wealth creation, whether it is about a specific thematic issue such as disinvestment or privatization or liberalization, or whether it is about any layer of business ethics, there are some basic principles of ethics that apply for business. Now, what are these ethics? You can take a note of these and then of course add some examples which I will give you right now in class. So the first ethical principle that must exist without any question is solidarity. Now, what is solidarity? Solidarity means or manifests when someone shows an active interest in the good of others and leads the business to contribute to the overall good of society. That the business that you're in fundamentally makes the lives of people better and therefore the society better. This active interest means this, if this is your underlying philosophy, that you're making businesses to add value to people, to make their lives better, to give them what they need as opposed to what they want, to solve actual problems. Because the government always can't solve all problems. You require the private sector because there is a financial enterprise in place. So the question is, will you sell what is needed or that genuinely creates a value? Or will you sell something just because you can make it? That's the basic difference, right? So for example, organic foods versus processed foods. It is easier, more industrial, definitely more cost effective to produce processed foods. And now there is recent research, there is very credible research that says processed food is fundamentally unhealthy for the human body. But because it's easier, it's mass consumption, you can sell it at an extremely lower cost to thousands of people, especially when life becomes fast and you're busy between jobs and commute and work, you will often turn to processed foods. But over a period of time, it is this very processed foods that is going to cause very long-term effects on your health. But just think about it. Where did you discover processed foods? There were people who manufactured it and then they smashed it across all departmental stores, anywhere you could lay your eyes on. From your local grocery shop to your national supermarket chains, you will see processed food everywhere you lay your eyes on. Whether it is cereals or processed juices or Nutri-Bars or biscuits or anything for that matter, your 2-minute noodles, anything. These are all fundamentally processed foods. What people do need are organic foods. Foods which are of course naturally produced, restored and stored with the right amount of nutrient value preserved in the right manner, not with preservatives. It's going to take you a long time for people to adapt to it, for people to prefer it. And that's essentially what the principle is. Hyper growth versus a form of settled incremental pace. That's usually the problem. That's usually what people are not understanding. Solidarity. The second ethical principle is efficiency. Remember, you can apply this to any question on market ethics, corporate ethics, eco-policy, anything. The second is efficiency. When you use the right amount of resources to do responsible business, some basic ways to practice this is, of course, don't waste your time in building something that is not needed, or for example, any resources which is not required, and providing or giving some kind of training which is not needed for employees to do their job really, really well. How can you most efficiently be the most productive? That's also very important. Most efficiently. So for example, when a lot of these beverage companies, specifically these aerated beverage companies, when they have to bottle their cold drinks, a lot of them depend on extraction of groundwater. Not only does it have an environmental impact, because you're essentially extracting groundwater, which sometimes seems like a flamboyant resource, there is also a lot of wastage. For example, there's a lot of wastage of food at restaurants. So how do you make sure that you are producing enough food, serving enough food, extracting the right amount of groundwater, replenishing it when you need to, so that you have the highest amount of productivity with the lowest amount of wastage? This is what is called efficiency. Then you have rationality. This is one of the most difficult principles of business. Making business decisions, relying on making those extremely crucial decisions in the best possible way, and not basing our decisions on caprices, whims, or biases, or solely on emotions, but rather on well thought out considerations. Just because you like cars doesn't mean you should get a car dealership. There might already be far too many in the area that you live in. So it must make business sense to do what you're doing. It must make the right amount of sense. It must fundamentally be a product market fit. A lot of times people get into business ratherly based on emotions, on trying to break competition, out of ego, out of vengeance, but it should be done very, very rationally. And rationality also means that doing a business that you're genuinely interested in. Let us say your heart lies in healthcare, but you're only getting funding to open a fintech startup. But your heart really does not lie in opening a fintech startup. Why would you spend your time on it? Because you know more about healthcare. You'd rather work and build a healthcare startup or a health startup with greater rigor and greater enthusiasm. Then why do you want to do this? For example, when startups in a hyper-growth mode tend to spend irrationally on market expenses, whether it's about brand ambassadors, whether it's about sponsoring sporting events, sponsoring mainstream TV programs, there's a balance. Or acquiring one company over the other. You have to be very rational about it, because that's going to come back. There is a reason why most startups, specifically in the edtech sector, are facing a funding winter, because they could have spent a little less, saved up a little more, and built sustainable businesses. That's the key, while being interested in the education space. The next principle is fairness. Fairness is you treat people the same way you wish to be treated. You should have all instances of partiality, favoritism in promotions and business interests to be avoided at all given point of time. You should not hire your relatives or your known ones on reference just because you know them or you're returning a favor. You should be fair. For example, at a business level, you should not sell a product that you don't believe in, that you don't think is ready yet. Don't misrepresent what you sell. Once you've taken money from people to do something, and you've taken money on your name, you have to be incredibly serious about it. There cannot be a misrepresentation, there cannot be a delay, there cannot be anything. It's taken me 9 to 10 years to finally build sort of a balance of sustainability and free education in my own space. But until I was very sure, dead sure, that this is exactly what I want, this is exactly what is needed, you can't take it out to the people at large. Businesses must be extremely fair. And you cannot deceive people into buying products. For example, a leading edtech company was in a massive amount of news for the way their sales representatives were calling children of parents and sort of arm twisting them, creating a fear quotient for them to buy their products, which is fundamentally wrong. Similarly, at a non-startup level, you see a lot of health insurance companies who have such complicated and such convoluted terms and conditions, which often lead to malpractices in discharging of health insurance claims. And these are fundamental problems that we deal with. The next principle is the principle of refraining from willingly harming others. If something has gone wrong, take willful cognizance of the fact that it has gone wrong. Own up to it. For example, if you have accidentally sold expired drugs, own up to it. Recall them back. For example, you would remember the Volkswagen Group. The Volkswagen Group was in terrible news. In fact, the NGT also in India had imposed a fine, and globally also they were fined millions and millions of dollars for cheating on pollution and emission control tests. They could have recalled their vehicles. A lot of auto manufacturers find faults in vehicles. It's a machine. There will be a problem. Fix it, recall it, change the battery if you have to. A lot of phone manufacturers often recall phones. It's okay. But don't sell something which is harming somebody else. For example, you would remember a leading company called Samsung, and you saw a lot of these old Samsung devices which started exploding, and they were not even allowed on aircrafts after a point. You should have recalled, and you should have summarily recalled. And it's extremely important for you to do so, extremely important. Then you look at, say for example, when you're looking at drug causing, for example, you've discovered a drug which cures cancer, but also causes nausea. So as an ethical company, you must inform the people of the side effects of your drugs and not sweep them under the carpet. And the last principle of a business is the role responsibility principle. The role responsibility principle is, and this is where it gets very technical, businesses have a responsibility to society at large. But businesses also fundamentally have a responsibility to the stakeholders in the business. If you're a shareholder in a business and the business is not generating profit for you, the business is fundamentally failing in its responsibility for you, in its responsibility towards you. For example, the much hyped Paytm IPO did not do very well on the stock market. In fact, there has been a larger issue about a lot of startup IPOs not doing very well. There hasn't been any major one which has done very, very well. They may see initial few weeks of highs, but eventually stock prices have been crashing ever since. There is a reason behind this. So these are the ethical businesses that we must know, ethical principles of business that we must know. And once we are done with this, there are actually a few, then we understand the consequences of it. What can we do and what can we do more? From a consequentialist point of view, we should definitely have some legal sanctions, fines. For that, we have the Economic Offenders Act, we have the Companies Act, we have FEMA, we have economic offences. We have a lot of framework in the country. We not only that, we also have SEBI guidelines. We also have guidelines by the international, by the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, the Institute of Company Secretaries of India for fair reporting, for fair auditing. We also I think now have the National Financial Reporting Authority, which also supervises auditing and accounting procedures. We also have mandatorily fortified corporate social responsibility as a part of the Companies Act, which was amended recently in 2013. There are, of course, changes which are required. There is an ethical component, but a lot of it has been done. But the usual consequences of violating these ethical principles are, of course, legal sanctions. There are also commercial consequences, such as the termination of business relationships and, for example, blacklisting. For example, you will also see a lot of damage that has been done to the brand reputation. You would remember an e-commerce company called Snapdeal or a company called ShopClues. Every time, for example, you order from a Flipkart or an Amazon and you order a phone and you got a brick in return, it hurts their brand reputation. If you have a bad work culture, if you have a toxic work culture, if you don't have a supportive work culture, you will see lower levels of employee satisfaction. You will not be able to retain them beyond a point. And therefore, you will often see very unethical employee behavior, which directly sort of harnesses away or takes away the reputation of the company. It could be in the form of embezzlement, wrong time of use of employee resources, confidentiality breaches such as insider trading, and so on and so forth. You also see people not working on time, delays, absenteeism, and so on and so forth. And as a result of this, you will see a lower level of customer retention and customer loyalty and so on and so forth. Brands or companies which have not been able to sustain their image have lost customers eventually. And of course, the risk of negative reactions from the community in which operates. Like, for example, I was unwell, I was hospitalized for almost a fortnight plus. I was still reading the YouTube comments, and of course I was deeply affected by it, because I knew, and because of the delays, of course, the students were a little anxious, and I could see the negative reactions. I was delayed in my work and now we're finishing it off, but I know the reactions that I've gotten. Can they be fixed? Yes, but they're also important. So we must always remember the consequences of certain actions. Now, how do we make it better in terms of the management of it? I've given you some 6-7 points, and you can pick the ones that you like and you can write it in your exams. First, the top management. They must always be willing and committed from a larger principle of an ethical correlation. If the business owners, if the senior management is not ethical, then everything else sort of trickles down. Second, the values and commitments that have been identified as the vision and the mission of the company, they must always be in some written form. They will not usually have a legislative recognition, but they must always be in some written form. Third, you must have some internal measures, some efficiency checks, some realignments, some internal audits, so that you know you're using your resources as effectively as possible. And these larger company values, company missions must be integrated into day-to-day business on a daily basis. So that even if it is, for example, a customer care representative of an airline called SpiceJet knows how to deal with an angry customer still very ethically. In very, very large businesses, it always makes sense to have this done through a website, through a video, through a podcast, through a broadcasting message. In, of course, smaller owner-led businesses, you could do one-on-one talks with the employees, you could do group discussions, but you must have the open channel of communication. You must always have an internal control system, so that if there is something that has gone wrong in the company, people are not feared to sort of come and report it in the form of, say, whistleblowing and so on and so forth. Companies should not only understand this, that it is a one-time process. It's not. It's a continued process. You have to keep evolving. You have to keep adding, reinventing your ethical principles, because with time, your basic ethical principles also change. That's very, very important. And companies should also strengthen your internal measures. For example, the way you are dealing with your suppliers. Are you releasing your payments on time? Have you built a relationship based on faith with your suppliers? And at a national level, at a sort of global level, you can contribute to achieving sustainable development goals. Don't make the mistake of thinking sustainable development goals can only and should be achieved with the responsibility of the government. The private sector has a fundamentally important role to play for us to achieve sustainable development goals. And that can be done, for example, by using cleaner or renewable energy, by paying fair salary to their employees. For example, the workplace health and safety is taken care of, using local supplies, paying taxes on time, supporting local education and education systems, promoting health and corporate responsibility. And if you come together, share your business practices, share your local practices at a local level, regional level, national level, international level, you could become a part of something called the UN Global Compact, which therefore helps to bring the best business practices for the notice of the world. And that's something we must truly aspire for. So this is the management of it, on how do you get better, what can you do from that standpoint. This takes care of your corporate business or corporate ethics for that matter. Now, how do you conclude? Any question on business corporate ethics, this is your standard conclusion. See, if businesses do not form partnerships with governments and society to address these issues, the sustainability of the planet is at risk. But at the same time, these issues present opportunities to corporations that are innovative and entrepreneurial. Why can't solutions to solving the world's problems not be profitable? For example, electric vehicles have the potential to change the way mankind fundamentally travels. There are certain bottlenecks in the EV ecosystem today, and they are going to be there for some time to come. And only through innovation and partnerships and dialogues between the private sector and government will you be able to see a truly compliant EV mode of transportation. In your conclusion, you have to emphasize that businesses cannot exist in isolation from the government or civil society, and governments can also not exist in isolation from the businesses. And this concludes corporate ethics. Now that we understand corporate ethics, we now move to the next part, which is AI ethics. Because the larger problem with artificial intelligence is how companies are managing it. Now, artificial intelligence or AI ethics could be introduced in two forms. One, of course, is a simpler process where you give me a definition of AI and you give me a data to AI. So this becomes your definition and this becomes your data. In the next slide, I'll give you some context. So you can use context and data, definition, data, context. This also can help you remarkably in your essays, because I've tried to cover as much as I could for artificial intelligence ethics. I've not gotten into the technicalities of the metaverse and the application, the use cases of AI. I've gotten into the ethical dimensions sort of landscape. So, artificial intelligence ethics is the term that gives a broad collection of considerations for responsible AI that combines safety, security, human concerns, and environmental decisions. This is your standard definition. That it is nothing but a set of value principles that make artificial intelligence better. Now, this is a report by McKinsey, which I found incredibly interesting, saying that artificial intelligence is a non-negotiable in the times to come. In some form or another, in some means or another, artificial intelligence is going to be a reality of who we are today. And this report clearly says that 78% of predictable physical work could be automated or could be replaced through some form of AI-enabled technology, which also basically means artificial intelligence and therefore technology as a whole is something you can't escape from. How do you learn to cohabit with it, and how do you learn to tame it to serve larger ethical interests is the question of the hour. So, artificial intelligence ethics, the context, and why are we talking about it? I've given you the definition already, but there are a few things that have happened which some of you may know, may not know. It is an economic powerhouse. It is expected, and this is the World Bank, it expects to generate nearly $4 trillion in US revenue, in US dollars, $4 trillion US dollars in revenue or the value by just 2022 itself, by the end of this year. What is also very interesting on the other hand is only 22% of all AI professionals are actually women. Now you might think, is this really that big of an issue? It is. It is an issue because as it is, women are underrepresented in the technology sector. Now in an advanced technology sector, when you see a lesser proportion of women, when you are developing technology that has the capacity to think, feel and react, it is essentially men who are making machines which can think, feel and react to both men and women. This is also called AI bias. For example, if you search school boy versus school girl on Google, the results that you're going to get are going to be fundamentally different. While this would be objectionable in nature and this would be descriptive in nature. That's the basic difference. Why is there an inherent bias in search algorithms? Because of an AI bias. There is a gender issue. Recently, about a year ago, one of the world's most prominent investment banks, Goldman Sachs, I've been able to get this from my notes on artificial intelligence are a combination of an article from the Harvard Business Review, an article from the Forbes, and some examples from the UNESCO dialogue on artificial intelligence, which happened very recently. These are essentially where I've primarily taken a lot of the material from. And one sort of a conference and a publication by the World Economic Forum. I could not find anything better than that. So, Goldman Sachs, which is one of the world's most well-known investment bank, one of the world's most powerful investment bank, was investigated by regulators in the US for using an artificial intelligence driven algorithm that allegedly discriminated against women by granting larger credit limits to men than women on their Apple cards. Apple also now in the US has payment interfaces. They've gone into fintech as well. All of you are famously aware of Facebook infamously granting a firm called Cambridge Analytica, which is a political data intelligence firm, access to personal data of more than 50 million users. The city of Los Angeles, the municipal corporation of Los Angeles, is actually suing IBM. The case is currently in a court in the US for misappropriating data it collected with its unique, rather problematic weather app. A very, very large US financial health services provider called Optum is currently being investigated by US regulators for creating an algorithm that recommends, and this is where the problem is, that doctors and nurses should pay more attention to white patients than to black patients because of reasons best known to the AI algorithm. And a lot of money has been spent. Amazon engineers last year shut down a very, very expensive program. More than $50 million was spent by Amazon on this program. They shut this down program because they were not able to create an artificial intelligence model that fundamentally doesn't discriminate against women when it came to developing AI-enabled hiring practices. One of Google's lesser known companies called Sidewalk Laboratories, have faced a massive backlash by local government and citizens because they wanted to build an IoT enabled smart city and they did not have the right data handling and the right ethical standpoints for this. This project was also worth $50 million, which was canned. So artificial intelligence and ethics is no longer a conversation left for the academics as a future possibility. It is here and it is now and it is there. It is a part of our everyday life, which is why we need to start talking about it, start addressing it yesterday. We're already late. So now that we understand this, let's understand the principles of artificial intelligence ethics and what can we do at a policy level and at an institution level to make it better. The basic principles of ethical issues or the ethical issues of artificial intelligence are what? There are about 9 issues. I'll give them to you. The first issue is that of unemployment. The primary purpose of technology is to reduce human effort. And this directly impacts the hierarchy of labor, which has sort of been created. Every time we automate something, we build a technology that makes the human job easier, you will often see work being replaced. You will often see lesser human beings required to do the same amount of jobs. Now, historically, humanity has always been known for adaptation. In the industrial revolution happened, everybody thought jobs are going to be lost, but people adapted. Now, as we've invented newer ways to automate jobs, we should also create room for people to assume more complex roles. What you wanted to do today versus what your work will be 20 years from now would be fundamentally different. So the whole premise of physical work in the pre-industrial globe to sort of the cognitive labor, very application-based labor, we are moving. For example, if Tesla in a few years comes up with self-driving trucks, what happens to all the truck drivers whose entire livelihoods are based on the transportation and the logistics industry? And therefore, this will lead to a form of inequality, if you may. See, using artificial intelligence, a company can drastically cut down the human workforce. And this means revenue will go to a fewer people. When there are lesser people doing the job, then lesser money has to be paid. So there will always going to be a sense of concentration of wealth. And therefore, people who own the technology and who own the AI-enabled mechanisms will, of course, have a lot more money. The third ethical issue is with humanity as a whole. See, artificially intelligent robots are certainly becoming better and better at modeling human conversations and relationships. Now, very interestingly, there was something called the Turing challenge. I don't know if you've heard of this or not. There's something called the Turing challenge. The Alan Turing challenge, but call it the Turing challenge. So what happened here was an AI-enabled chatbot was supposed to interact with humans and non-humans and get the responses. What was heartening to know was that a majority of the responses, and human beings could not tell whether the response was from an AI-enabled chatbot or not, and second, it was able to self-learn and deliver. Artificially intelligent bots, right? For example, today you open a shopping website, you'll see a pop-up. There's not a real person talking to you. It's an artificially enabled bot. See, we will continue to develop a sense of technology which at some point or the other will model human conversation and relationship. We will interact with machines as we were interacting with humans, whether it's customer service or sales or grievances or any of that kind. But at the same time, human beings may lack a certain kind of attention, may have a certain kind of limitations on kindness. Artificial intelligence, if actually used properly, can have unlimited resources to truly build kindness. And is that going to be possible? That's a very important ethical concern. Apart from this, artificial stupidity, something which is one of my favorites. See, the primary development of intelligence is from learning, right? The more you learn, the more intelligent you become, whether you're a human being or a machine. Now, what happens is machines usually have a training phase where you're taught a certain amount of responses, and based on a certain amount of responses, you are supposed to react in a certain way. This definitely applies to machines also. But the problem with artificial intelligence is you will never ever be able to cover all possible scenarios. For example, if it's an AI-driven car and there is a grandparent and a 6-year-old child on the road, what turn should the AI car take? How will you key in these very specific variables? And therefore, it is very easy to sort of trick AI into taking certain actions. And then you also have the issue of bias. I'll give you an example. There is a lot of talk about using artificial intelligence in the legal systems, where It can help the lawyers research better, annotate better, do a lot of cross-case comparisons better. It also helps the judiciary sort of analyze past cases, look at possible outcomes and determine possible outcomes. But how do you know that this is not an inherently biased system? Because historically you will see, for example, in India, death penalty is more awarded to people of lower castes. In the US, you will see people who are not white have been accused of crimes more. And if AI is based on data, then it would want to accuse or convict more people of that specific composition more. So there is always a generation of bias. See, no doubt, what AI can do in terms of speed and performance and accuracy, humans can't. You're essentially creating a better species. But it cannot always be fair and neutral, right? For example, Google and its parent company Alphabet are one of the leaders which comes to artificial intelligence development. Like, for example, where you have the Google photo service where you take a photo and you don't know what it is, it can tell you what it is. That's basically artificial intelligence. It can be then amalgamated into facial recognition tools which can have multiple impacts. But also it can go wrong. For example, if a camera missed a mark on racial sensitivity, or when a software used to predict future criminals showed bias against black people. And because it's technology will always have a security risk. Humans also have a security risk, but technology also does. For example, the more powerful the technology becomes, the more chances are there that it would be used for the wrong reasons. Take historically the case of nuclear technology, right? Nuclear technology has fundamentally altered. It's no longer civilian nuclear technology. It's the larger problem with nuclear technology today is the armament of it, is the militarization of it. And this applies not only to robots produced, or not only to robots to produce to replace human soldiers. It also could mean developing autonomous systems, drones that can of course cause a lot of damage if used maliciously. And very interestingly, AI in defense and arms is a double-edged sword. You don't know, because you could remote control it and then it could go anywhere you want. So there are a few more ethical considerations or ethical issues. Unintended consequences. For instance, artificial intelligence is very result oriented. It's not particularly means that lead to an end. So, for example, there is no doubt there's very low chance that there's going to be some malice at play, but you can't know the reasons as to why artificial intelligence or an AI enabled system has predicted a specific course of action. We can imagine an advanced AI system as nothing but a genie in a bottle. For example, if it says that you give the AI system a problem that we should free the world of cancer, its recommendation could be kill anybody who has cancer. If you kill everybody who has cancer, eventually the world will not have cancer in that way. Is that the right solution? No, it is not. But it is a solution. A terrible solution, but a solution. And eventually one of our biggest concerns with artificial intelligence is singularity. Human dominance, the reason why human beings are the dominant species on the planet, is largely because of ingenuity and intelligence. Now we are creating machines who are also capable to be intelligent, to also have self-thinking capacities. We get bigger, we get faster, we build better tools, better infrastructure, better machines, understood. But the question is, will artificial intelligence have an edge over us? And if they do, will they become superior, right? And lastly, if a machine has feelings, if a machine can think, if corporations can be legal persons, then machines can be legal persons. What happens to the rights of those machines? They would be called what are called feeling machines, right? So what do we do to solve this? At an organizational level, and this is from, of course, the Harvard Business Review article, identify existing infrastructure that a data and ethics program can leverage. Whatever you have internally within your organizations, within your companies, wherein there are some checks and guidelines made. Second, have a data and AI ethical risk framework. That is, for example, all across the transportation industry, these are your basic norms for the use of AI in transportation, in logistics, in medicine, in healthcare, in education, in space, and so on and so forth. Have proper training mechanisms. Make sure people in your organization understand where AI powers or AI mechanisms or programs have to be controlled. And formally as well as informally, behind the doors, empower your employees to make the right decisions, to come to the organization and report AI risks. And AI is not just about the company and the government, it's also about ultimate stakeholders. If you're using artificial intelligence in healthcare, the ultimate beneficiary of the healthcare are people who are using healthcare, the patients. Understand the impacts of AI on them, rather than just doctors and nurses and hospitals and so on and so forth. So at an organizational level, this is what we can do. At a policy level, we must have ethics or AI impact assessments. Both companies and governments should develop sort of mechanisms, organizations. Third, there should be monitoring of all appropriate measures. Fourth, when you're looking at AI governance from an institutional point of view, from a legislative point of view, it should be interdisciplinary. AI should never just be about AI and data. AI should be about AI and data in other sectors. And if there are issues, there are crimes, there are harms that are being caused, there should be dedicated legislative action for it. It is a shame that we have withdrawn our data protection bill and we're looking at the use of data 2022, which has been recently put into practice, but it's still a long way to go. And it should never just be between the companies and the government, civic society, civic action groups, internet rights foundations, and so on and so forth. They should also be addressing concerns of artificial intelligence. So if there is a question on artificial intelligence, whether in an essay or ethics, you have enough to write. Which then makes us move to the next topic, which is media ethics. So how do you introduce it? If you're writing an essay, you could write both the things. If you're writing just an ethics question, the second point is more than enough. Contextually, journalism has always been considered one of the four pillars of democracy, in fact the fourth pillar of democracy. Largely because its job is to communicate extremely important information to the public, and this information that is being communicated to the public is about public institutions, private institutions, and people at large. And these people at large are usually people who occupy a certain position and power in society. So an informed citizenry is critical for good governance and essential for exposing and preventing corruption. This assumes that the information is accurate, truthful, and of course non-biased. If your job is to communicate what has happened to the people, then you have an ethical obligation to ensure that reporting is fantastically correct and can't be changed. From a definitional point of view, the concept of media ethics, as we know, broadly refers to proper standards of conduct that media providers and disseminators, this is important, media providers and disseminators should attempt to follow. With modern technology and increased globalization in today's world, there are many more branches of media than there were in earlier times in history. Today, if you look at it from an ethical point of view, there are more than 400 media codes in the world, more than 400. There's something called responsible journalism or accountablejournalism.org as a portal where you can check all of these media codes. I referred to it to understand certain broad principles so that I could have taught the same to you. Now the context is, why is it important? Why do we need to discuss this? See, from an Indian context, journalism or journalists do not get any special rights or protections from the legal system in India. The fundamental rights of a journalist or the rights of a journalist are exactly the same as any other individual, which is honestly a fundamental problem. There must be some additional protections given to journalists so that they can do their job well. But on the whole, media professionals are held to have a higher ethical standard than non-media professionals, because they have a duty of care to society to provide accurate, truthful and non-biased information. Any job that you have which has a direct impact on society, whether you're a doctor or a lawyer or a civil servant, or for that matter a media professional, anything of that sort, you will always have a higher standard of ethics that will apply to you. Media professionals will have ethical obligations to society simply by the virtue of their activities as journalists, reporters, actors and owners of media corporations. Always a higher. Whether it is a journalist, a reporter, an anchor, owners of media corporations, and even for that matter, citizen journalists, if you may. In an essay, you can elaborate on the content, which is the role of the media today, of course, has been deeply affected by commercialization and a diversity of media actors. You must understand that the amount of money which is being pumped into the media, the valuation of the media industry as a whole, because an industry like any other industry should also grow, and not only this, but the sheer diversity of media actors. In media is no longer about print and electronic. There are several forms of print, there are several forms of electronic media, which is why it has become a very complex affair, a very, very complex set of affairs. Whether it is independent media, corporate media, advocacy groups, consolidated media conglomerates like you have the Times Network, the Aaj Tak Group, India Today Group, state-owned like the Doordarshan, Sansad TV, privatized media like smaller channels. Media ethical obligations will apply to all of these. Whether it is a Wire, whether it is the Alt, whether it is News Laundry, whether it is a Times Now, whether it is a Republic, whether it's the Times Network, whether it is a public broadcasting service. Media ethics apply to any organization of any kind which is performing a role. In fact, what becomes very interesting is in our line of work, in my line of work, especially when teachers are delivering current affairs programs, a lot of people get their current affairs from current affairs videos, right? So is a UPSC teacher also a media professional in that manner? So the lines are fairly blurred. And therefore today, a lot of ethical issues arise in relation to the internet. And the internet has really taken media to another stratosphere, if you would say. Because of accessibility, there is of course a larger issue of who is responsible, where do we fixate responsibility, and so on and so forth. And as I was telling you, technology has also enabled citizen journalists who have two functions. One, to report something on a mobile phone camera, or to share something that has been shared with them, right? And both of these become very sensitive ethical issues. So people are, of course, recording, photographing and videotaping newsworthy events, and citizen journalists also compound media ethics issues because they are also now not only consumers of information but also disseminators of information. And therefore an underlying theme in media ethics today, of course, is the potential conflict between standards of ethical behavior and profitability. If you want advertisers, you will have to do a certain kind of news, and for you to do a certain kind of news, will you attract a certain kind of advertisers? Then censorship and the role of the government and the society as a whole. There is a lot more that goes on. There's a lot more that genuinely meets the eye. So, if this is the case, how do we go about it? How do we solve this problem? Let's look at it. As far as media ethics in India is concerned, we essentially have 4 codes. First is the Code of Ethics for All India Newspapers Editors Conference. Second, we have a code for covering communal incidents. Third, we have a norm for journalistic conduct. And of course, we have the Press Council of India, which does give certain guidelines that have to be followed. But largely, media in India is self-regulated. And why does it even become important? Because just a few months ago, the Press Index, Freedom Index is released of 2022, and India has fallen to 150 out of 180. I think it was 142 last year, and of course this is by the Reporters Without Borders. So the Indian media is not in a particularly good shape, which is why it also becomes sort of important. Now, there are essentially 5 principles for journalists and media providers. First is seek truth and report it. 2, minimize harm. 3, act independently. 4th, be accountable and transparent. And 5th, be objective. What does that mean? First is, you have a responsibility, the absolute responsibility, to confirm the accuracy of what you are reporting. 2, your work should give more transparency and more accessibility to people who are in power. Third, your work is to also represent and echo the voices of those whose voices are not heard. Fourth, you should be supportive of an open dialogue of communication. News has 2 components. One, to deliver X as X has happened, and Y, to entertain all forms of opinion around X, which is mostly the problem in India. And therefore, you of course have a special responsibility as a watchdog over government and public affairs or business affairs. And while you are doing all of this, you must have respect for individual privacy while you are of course seeking sort of the truth. Now, the examples here are far too many. You could think of, say, fake news, paid news. You could see irresponsible journalism. You could see in the Aryan Khan case. You could see non-reporting of COVID deaths, migration-related news, the whole Indo-Pak news coverage. You could see how political incidents such as the Maharashtra issue has been reported. There are enough examples that you can pick up. The second principle is the principle of minimizing harm. See, it can only, any report will have an objection to a certain number of people. Some people are not going to like the fact that you've reported this. The question is, who are those people? And in terms of actual harm, for example, let us say you're reporting an RTI activist who has disclosed a scam. The way you've reported it should make sure that there is no inherent danger to the RTI activist. There is of course a doctrine of confidentiality which applies here. And therefore, you must make sure that whatever you're reporting, for example, if there is a riot, a media coverage can make that riot a communal riot, can make it a caste riot, could make it a gender riot, could make it any form. And then the harm that it can cause, because then it will spread like wildfire, is a different ballgame altogether. And you should always have some form of compassion to those who are affected by the coverage. For example, a disaster has happened, a family has lost their entire house because of the floods. You can't barge into them and ask uncomfortable questions. For example, if somebody's lost their child in the front line, respect their privacy. For example, if a parent's child has been sentenced to prison for a heinous crime, imagine the state of conflict the parent would be in. And lastly, mindful of cultural differences in the ways news or information can be perceived. Because projectionism and perception are the underlying features of the media, they must be handled with absolute care. Thirdly, you've got to act independently, and this is where it becomes very different and also slightly difficult. No doubt you'll have an obligation to your bosses, you will have an obligation to your advertisers, you will have an obligation to your sponsors, but you're in the business of public communication. So the public must be first more than anything else, no matter who's paying for your new show, no matter who's paying your salary. And therefore, any form of paid news, any form of biased coverage will always be objectionable from an ethical standpoint. And as a journalist, you yourself should be accountable and transparent. When you're saying that you think this has happened, you've conducted a survey, you must release the entire findings of the survey. You and your news coverage must be very transparent and accountable to the people. On what basis do you think this has happened, and why are you saying this has happened? It could not be and it should not be based on hearsay, as it happens when the media covers a lot of celebrity criminal cases without knowing what the actual facts are. This, of course, is a legally problematic issue because it can also cause defamation. And then finally, objectivity. See, human beings can never be truly objective. It's very difficult to be unquestionably objective. But the question is, journalism or journalists should always disclose that frame of reference. That from where I look at it, from this perspective, this makes sense. For example, if you are, let us say, covering a demolition exercise. Now, how do you cover it? You're saying that, okay, I'm here on ground, there seems to be a few excessive construction that is being made. However, prior notices were not given to the local occupants. Therefore, this has caused a little bit of an issue. Your frame of reference must be very clearly and very categorically disclosed. And similarly, you have ethical principles for citizen journalists. These guys are not media professionals. It is you and me who take a mobile phone and make a reel out of it. They're usually bystanders with a smartphone. And therefore, they will often have access to unfolding events that often journalists may not have because it takes time for them to reach. And because of this, because of the global nature of social media, all it takes is for you to take a video and share it on social media and it goes viral in no time. For example, the Hurricane Sandy of 2012, the Fukushima earthquake of 2011, the Boston Marathon bombing of 2013, the Paris attacks of 2015, and several other global conflicts. Remember the COVID migration issue, the COVID death issue, the oxygen issues. All of them were being reported largely through citizen journalists who saw what was happening on ground, were able to capture it from a frame of reference, and then of course truth was tried to prevail in some form. See, ordinary citizens should never be discouraged from sharing what they see. This you should maintain this principle. However, they also have a duty to act with care because their principles are two-dimensional in nature. One, the same principles of reporting, and the second is sharing something which has been shared with them. Is it authentic? The source has been verified. Don't basically share fake news. So these are your basic ethical principles for citizen journalists and media consumers. And your conclusion is, there are several studies that show that members of the public usually have a significant difficulty on assessing the credibility of social media content, which is why most of the problem lies. So therefore, it is even more important to think about the ethical implications of what we share online. To conclude, therefore, this illustrates that media ethics applies to all of us. Media ethics applies to all of us, whether or not we intend to be media professionals or not. So every time you share a link with somebody, every time you share a document with somebody, or a video with somebody, or a tweet somebody, all of us are subject to media ethics, and that should be your concluding statement. Now, from here, we'll move to the last segment of the class, which is international ethics. This is very simple.
has been asked enough. There are several examples that we could sort of look at. Now, let's start with international ethics. So what is international ethics? International ethics refers to the good that international interactions, exchanges, or relations sort of bring to our planet. Now, so here's the thing. When you study international relations, there are several theories of international relations like realism and idealism and constructive realism and constructive idealism and cosmopolitanism. I don't think that's important for ethics. If you can quote a little bit, sure. So realism is national interest and self-interest is what matters. Idealism is common good and pursuing common interests is what matters. Constructive realism is a balance of both, figuring out common goods and also balancing national interest. So international ethics refers to the good that international interactions, exchanges, relations can bring to our planet Earth and to all life forms which can be harmed by unfriendly, hostile or uncooperative behaviors. The principle of international ethics is to do good for the world as a whole. And therefore international ethics is not simply an ethic of a dominant country. It's not something about what better or more powerful countries can do. It is always about a collective idea. And the best material on international ethics that I could find was actually from a recent 2020 IGNOU document which had international ethics. I've watered it down and cut it down significantly, but I must tell you very honestly, these are not my words, these are words from IGNOU that I found very, very good. Now, the determinants and the impacts, your answers, your questions will come from here only, and this is this is not anything more than that will therefore not be required. The first and the most primary determinant of international ethics is population. See, we often understand that demographics, or the study of population, is a domestic issue. It actually is more than a domestic issue. Populations also determine migration policies. So countries with heavy populations will always have very difficult migration policies, and companies with negative or declining populations will always have better migration policies. And countries with heavy populations would always want to aspire to transport their population as skilled populations all across the world. Which is why you would often think one of India's foreign policy objectives should be to become the human resources capital of the world, because India obviously is magically bestowed with population. You would also see countries like US, not anymore, but to a large extent Canada, Australia, New Zealand have had significantly easy immigration norms, and it was further easier to migrate to an Australia, New Zealand or a Canada if you were traveling for education or if you were already technically educated, ready for employment. So in a lot of these cases, population therefore becomes a principle of international ethics. For example, one of the primary reasons why India had an issue accepting refugees is the primary population burden of India. The second important reason why India, for example, let us say, from the government side, the argument is that we needed to make the changes to the Citizenship Amendment Act and we needed to create segmentation on the basis of persecution, is that we already have an overburdening population problem. So population plays a very, very important role. And you will always see that nations will want to welcome talented working populations. And if you see the recent reports on demographic dividend, where we understand that while India has a massive opportunity, the percentage is going to decrease over a few years from now, the percentage of working age population. But very interestingly, in the next 10 years, we will have, for example, more people in the working age population than China. Right now, China has more. But the problem is, India has a very low percentage of working population in the skilled formal sector. Most of it is either informal labor or unskilled. So that's an issue, but has an international consequence. Second, economy. So as international trade increases, the sphere of international relations always grows. Now, if you look at it in terms of multilateral frameworks such as the WTO, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, you see, for example, bilateral mechanisms such as BRICS. These are all, or for that matter, Quad. They were all developed fundamentally to support each other. For example, the I2U2, which is supposed to be the Quad of the Middle East, all of them are supposed to provide a sense of an alternate, right, which clearly is to strengthen multilateral economic facilities. And it is economy which also has driven some of the major conflicts. For example, all of us have been reading about, say, the issue of the Chinese debt trap, where Hambantota port in Sri Lanka was developed. It's argued that they may not have needed it, but now they can't pay it back. So China is saying we're going to use it the way we want to. For the fact that now Bangladesh is approaching the IMF for a $1.5 billion loan, and all of this comes with consequences, right? So a lot of this has to do with strengthening economies, strengthening dependence and interdependence ecosystems. The third is competition between nations. See, nations will always compete in the international space, and national advantages will always have a space in international ethics. But the question is, how do we compete? For example, when we see a lot of these indices, such as the Global Competitiveness Index, the Freedom Index, the Democracy Index, the Human Development Index, the Ease of Doing Business Index, the Sustainability Index, this also drives nations to better their mechanisms. For example, if India ratifies certain goals of the Sustainable Development Program, the World Bank funds India to achieve those goals. There's an entire cycle in place. Fourth, competition for ecological system advantage. This is where a new era has come in. See, what has happened now is, in the times to come, nations have to secure environmental sustainability for them. They need the resources to survive and to support them for the next generations to come, which means their IR, their foreign policy should be structured in a manner wherein they have the resources and a sustainable environment to see them through the times to come. The other determinant of international relations is interdependence, cooperation, and of course collaboration. For example, when we see India dependent on Russia for oil, India dependent on the Middle East for oil, let us say Nepal dependent on India for certain exports, US dependent on India for certain service sector, India dependent on South America for certain imports. There is a lot of interdependence. There is a lot of cooperation. For example, when you look at Quad, we look at I2U2, we look at SAARC, we look at BRICS, we look at the New Development Bank, we look at regional bilateral initiatives, we look at the G20, the G7, the groups. There is of course a lot of cooperation in place, and of course collaboration. For example, when you look at space, when we look at Arctic exploration, when we look at deep sea exploration, all of these have to be multinational, multi-governmental exercises, because beyond the point, it is very difficult for nations to sustain such kind of highly expensive yet very important exercises. The next is diplomatic relations and understanding. One very important determinant of international relations is the kind of relations that have been diplomatically established between countries. For example, there is almost an impossible or a non-existent diplomatic relation between North Korea and South Korea. For so many years, France did not even have a diplomatic recognition of North Korea. So there are of course implications. For example, the whole recognition of Palestine issue, for example, recognition of, say, the territorial issues in Kashmir, or for example Sri Lanka. Wherever there are issues of alternate or separationism or any separatism or so on and so forth, diplomatic relations play a very, very long role, a very, very long role. Of course, next is defense and military enterprise. Now, in recent context, you will see that, for example, the US has passed a law granting a CATSA sanctions waiver to India, and of course, in the garb of it, saying that fine, you have an old military partnership with Russia, continue, but also increase your partnership with India, which is what India has done actually. A lot of our Apaches, a lot of our light machine guns, all of them are now coming from the States as well. I think we have a $20 billion military contract with the United States. We also continue to have our S-400 missiles. In fact, the first unit just came in a few months ago from Russia. So there is a lot of military enterprise, there's a lot of military relations that exist, whether it's US or Russia or Israel for that matter. So military enterprise has always been an issue. Now, that is one way to look at it. The other is how nations all across the world either collaborate or confront each other when it comes to conflicts. And the strongest example of that, of course, has been the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And in the Russia-Ukraine crisis, we've seen this hit us the hardest. Of course, apart from this, you also have the issue of poverty and the wealth of the nations. For example, you will always see some form of international dialogue, some form of diplomacy, wherein because there are few nations which are poor and there are a few nations which are rich, there will always be some form of dialogue of cooperation or supremacy on which works on both of these. Now let's understand this. See, nations will always want to get richer, and because nations will also want to get richer over a period of time, you will also require international actors to help them get better. But the problem is that poverty is no longer a domestic issue, it's an international issue. Because nations which could have spent a lot more money on a lot of other sectors have to solve foundational problems of poverty before they move ahead, which is why you have the Food and Agricultural Organization, you have the World Bank, you have so many multilaterals, bilaterals, you have non-state actors such as the Bill and Gates Foundation and so on and so forth, who are working so hard to solve the poverty issue. Then we have the inequality of nations, which is essentially that when we see the inherent inequality that exists, we have to now look at international NGOs, international non-state actors who also come in and help us out. Furthermore, very minor points, you will not have the time to write them, but just in about one minute each, freedom of speech plays a very, very important role in terms of how the international press, in terms of international actors, in terms of how religion can always have a transnational impact on international relations, right? So for example, Turkey's stand on an issue affects India-Turkey relations, right? Similarly, US's stand on or certain actions around Islam in the US has an impact on Middle Eastern US relations. So those always will keep a lot of ground to fall. Then of course is technology. Technology today drives the world, and how nations all across the world facilitate movement of technology, sharing of technology, how corporations manage privacy and other standards, they will all play a very, very long role. And of course, scientific research in space, in deep sea, in maritime conservation, of course, are all very, very important elements. This is more than enough for IR. I don't think you really need to do more. The examples are far too many. I'll give you a list of examples on the database, which I'll update in a day or two, and this covers your theme. Now the difficult part of ethics is over. Philosophers and governance is left. I'll just finish them up. This is very standard and very static, just case studies and best practices have to be added. This was tough up until now when we had to sort of get more research because it's all over the place and standard material does not seem to be good enough. So we are now done with this. We're finished with these. I'll see you in the next lecture, among other things, very, very soon. Thank you.